you very much. Thank you for the introduction and being invited. It's always wonderful. 89 that I came and I lived in Budapest for 2 years and worked as a correspondent for different media in Germany and the United States. And I also wrote the very first book on extreme nationalism and radical right-wing parties in Hungary. I was part of a book. I'm going to talk today about Ukraine, and I think that the title of my speech or talk is something along the lines of how Ukraine's civic resistance squashed the radical right. That's more of a hypothesis, I think. But what I can say for sure after spending a large part of the last 5 years in Ukraine is that there is at the moment no right-wing parties or movements anywhere to be seen, not in the society, not on the front, not in the media, not in the parliament. What I want to talk to you about is the phenomena of mass civilian engagement in Ukraine and the de facto civic democracy that I think has a lot to offer North America and Europe. It's collective, do it yourself, we can do it, we are Ukraine feeling is the opposite and perhaps also an antidote. That's very much a hypothesis to Europe's radical right, which relies on empty promises, conspiracy theories, and passive subjectivity. What's happening in Ukraine is the opposite of that. There is indeed no right wing in Ukraine right now. I do not know what the Orban and what the Fidesz line was on this Russian claims that Ukraine was full of fascists and neo-Nazis and everything. But this is something, of course, this is a claim that's made by Russia, also by the American left, and then I would assume by Fidesz people as well. It is not true. After the Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, there were elections. The radical right got two parties, got together 6.5% of the vote. In a parliament of 450, they had 7 members. The last elections that were held in Ukraine were in 2019. The 3 radical right parties got under 2% of the vote. So that really puts paid to that. I think that, of course, that there is some right-wing nationalists and extremists around there somewhere, and they'll probably pop out of the woodwork when elections come, if there ever are normal elections in a sense of a normal political environment in Ukraine. I think that they will emerge as they have everywhere else in the European Union. But what today, I want to try to get a little bit across this cross-generational, countrywide self-organization that's happened in Ukraine. I mean, there are now 35 million people in the country, and almost everybody's engaged. But what's really important is where people have come together in the forms of NGOs or nonprofits or fundraising platforms or volunteer brigades or informal groups that have come together of their own accord. I mean, all of this is independent of the state. Ukrainians have a very poor opinion of the state and of political parties. So when they see that something needs to be done, they don't think first, oh, no, why doesn't the government do this, and then complain about it and do nothing. They take it in hand and they start doing it themselves. I could give you dozens and dozens of examples. And this is one of the problems about describing or writing about social movements, is that it's like a big patchwork quilt. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of patches. But I'll give you a couple of examples. And I'm working on a full-length book about this topic, and there I hope to be able to more at length talk about some of the, I think, incredible social innovation and ingenuity that Ukrainians have shown. Let me just simply say that, let me just pick one organization. It's called Pulse. It was founded in 2014 by 3 young men. They were first-year students at the University of Odessa. One was law, another one actually, he was a sailor, and then the third one was a medical student. And they realized that Ukraine didn't have an emergency medical strategy for the front line. It was still basically a Soviet army, and that was basically, as we can see there by the today, it's what are called meat waves. Just keep sending people and let them die. And so they downloaded by themselves manuals from the American Red Cross, and they taught themselves how to be medics, They took the tests and everything and became ministers. And then they started teaching for free anybody who was part of the military, the police, or the border guard, and at different levels of first aid and emergency battlefield medicine. At a certain point, they realized they needed some money for this too. So they started a private company called FAST, and it offered similar services to the private sector. And so they were able to take the money from their organization in the private sector, and they were able to fund the NGO Pulse that was that by now has had 35,000 members of the Ukrainian Armed Forces go through its training processes. And I mean, they also are now on the front line doing blood transfusions and other things. They're also now, they're still working in Odessa. They're still carrying out these trainings, and at the same time, they're raising money for the emergency medical units that are on the front right now. Another organization, Building Ukraine Razom, Building Ukraine Together, it's called. There was also a first-year college student from Lviv, Yurko Dirula, and a couple of friends, who realized two things. Number one, that the Ukrainians from Western Ukraine and the Ukrainians from Eastern Ukraine didn't know each other very well. And also that there was, after the Maidan Revolution, there was a huge burst of volunteer and of civic engagement. And tens of thousands of different kinds of non-governmental organizations were founded and put into effect. And so part of this, one of these is BUR. And the idea was to bring East and West together, but also to have volunteer brigades that would go to different places in the country and rebuild destroyed housing that was sort of destroyed by the Russians in the fighting that happened in 2014 and afterwards. This organization still exists today. Hundreds and hundreds of camps in different places in the country have been, have happened. I visited one of them in the summer. It was not far from Kharkiv. You could hear the rumbling of artillery and the buzz of drones not so far away. It was all, I was anticipating some internationals there, because it's one of the things that international people can do to volunteer as well. And this organization like this, as one could in hundreds of different, there are also international volunteers from the international brigades to this and to other organizations. And it was about 35 young Ukrainians who were building out it was basically a bomb shelter or an underground school. I guess they're basically the same thing, underneath a school that was in a village very near the front. So it was also the bomb shelter for the whole village, but it was where the school then would be relocated when there were bomb warnings. And they had pranking tunes and getting the work done when we were there, and then laying out like a yoga mat, like about this thin, and sleeping on concrete floor, and they all seemed to be having a really good time of it. The village people, they provided all of the food that was necessary, and so there was a table, and each day new things, food would come in. So this ethic is widespread everywhere. I mean, there's a real one for all, everybody, we're all together feeling in Ukraine, which is really special, despite the fact that they are traumatized, that they are exhausted, that they're being hit every single day by Russia. So I don't want to minimize that in my enthusiasm for this civic phenomenon. And in addition, and this is happening. I mean, there's so much participation in society. There is so much constituting of society itself that I feel this very democratic culture. And it's really just unlike anything I've really experienced before. Although, sure, Central Europe at the beginning of the 1990s or East Berlin in the early 1990s, might be something somewhat like it. But I think this is even more of a countrywide, cross-generational phenomenon that really includes almost everybody. And when I step back and take a look at it, I would say it fits the definition of what is called civic democracy. I'm not an expert about civic democracy, but let me just read you the definition, okay? It's a form of governance and community life centered on active citizen participation, collective action, and shared responsibility to improve public life. It emphasizes that democracy is an ongoing act requiring engagement beyond voting to ensure equity, accountability, and the fostering of a vibrant community. That's what's happening in Ukraine right now. They can't vote. There's martial law since 2022. There haven't been elections since 2019. Men in between the ages of 22 and 60 can't leave the country. There's basically a ban on public assemblies, although nobody seems to respect it really. So on the one hand, you've got these, and of course you have the Russian siege as well. And yet, nevertheless, in the face of these obstacles, I think the Ukrainians have at least shown us a spirit that could really revive the democracies in the European Union and those in North America as well. I mean, there are arguments. Experts who are experts in civic democracy, say that civic democracy does work as an antidote to national populism and far-right movements, centering on re-engaging citizens in local participatory processes that combat apathy, frustration, and perceived exclusion that fuel populist support. By prioritizing inclusive grassroots participation over top-down political structures, civic democracy aims to strengthen democratic resilience and diminish the us versus them narratives used by far-right actors. And so this democratic resilience, everybody knows how resilient the Ukrainians are. It's become like a cliche. Even the New York Times, it's a cliche. But as for the democratic resilience, that people don't talk about. Local civic action ensures that political attention is focused on the practical, local issues rather than the abstract, divisive cultural anxieties that are exploited by far-right movements. It is, as I said, very much the opposite of what the far-right is all about. And whether it is this movement that has undermined the far-right in Ukraine or not, I can't really say that for sure. And we're going to find out what happens when the elections are going. But I think that this is a social movement that began long before the war, although it was turbocharged on February 24th, 2022. Certainly the Maidan Revolution, everybody would look back to as the moment when civil society really exploded in Ukraine. But you can really go back to the very first of their revolutions, the Revolution on Granite in 1991, and then the Orange Revolution 2004, 2005, and then comes Maidan. Recently, there was yet another revolution. Actually, I think I'd call it more myself kind of protests, but the cardboard protests of July of last year. What happened was that the government took a decision that was very unpopular, particularly among the people in civil society and those people that come out of Maidan. And that was to restrict the agency restrict the powers and the independence of the official anti-corruption agency, which was an institution that came out of Maidan. Civil society was extraordinarily unhappy with this, and they went out in protest. They called it the cardboard revolution because it all happened so fast that people just took out pieces of cardboard and black magic markers and scrawled their sayings on the slogans on them. One of them was, "My brother didn't die for this." Exactly. It was Generation Z above all, I mean, like it was in Hungary as well, so important. They were young people who were basically too young even to really remember Maidan. But they saw this as a violation of everything that they stood for, and so they used another form of democratic participation to cancel it. And indeed, Zelensky, I don't know what was going through his mind at the time. I can only imagine that maybe he was distracted and looking, he's dealing with things internationally, and that this was his chief of staff's idea, but he changed it the next day. And so Ukraine still has now a functioning anti-corruption agency which is working even at a time of war. The Ukrainians have not opted to go for the strongman approach, which very often happens in war. So you've got this incredible phenomenon happening at a time when you actually least expect it.